right.
But
Welcome everybody. I'm never sure when this actually starts on YouTube because it starts before it actually says it starts. So I try and start a little bit before. But welcome everybody as we're here with the Rabbi Interviews. And it is a pleasure to have Larry Rosendorf with us, as always, helping ask questions. And we're going to be interviewing today the wonderful Carol Pine, who, if you've not heard about her before, we're going to learn a lot about her, not only what she has done throughout her life, but a particular thing she has founded in recent years. So welcome, Carol. She's from Minnesota, moved to Savannah 11 years ago. She is a very well-known business author, has written several books, both on corporate history and on business biographies. She came here because of the weather, as so many people do, and because she loves to sail and cruise. So welcome, Carol. And this is also Jane here, by the way.
thank you, Robert.
It's a real pleasure. I've had the pleasure of working with her on the organization she founded through Trinity, the Trinity Methodist Church recently, but we'll get to that in a moment. So Carol, you're from Minnesota. So where were you raised and what did you do for professionally before you moved here and continued your professional work?
Well, I was raised in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I was trained at the University of Minnesota to be a journalist, and I have spent my entire life working as a journalist, and more specifically in the last, 30 years, as a business journalist.
And when you were in St. Paul, did you work there and you were raised and you stayed there? Or did you move somewhere else before?
I pretty much stayed in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul. I did move closer to a large lake west of Minneapolis called Lake Minnetonka, and that's where I discovered my love of sailing, which became a very big part of my life and still is here in Savannah.
Wow, and I think we all remember that the name from what's it, Prairie Home Companion. I think they mentioned that many times. So right. I've heard of it. I've never been to that part of the country, but hopefully one day I'll make it up there. And so when you were raised, did you want to go into journalism and writing? Is that what you originally thought you were going to do?
You know, it actually was, and quite surprisingly, I was literally a closet writer as a very young little child. I was part of a family that today we call it dysfunctional. Then it was just bewildering. And I had literally a large closet that I could walk into, and I started writing stories. And I think it probably, looking back on it, was a great salve for me as a little kid. I continue to write stories, but they're no longer fiction. So that's the only difference.
Yeah, it sounds like how long have you been writing now for? You said 30 years, but it's longer than that.
Oh, easily. I graduated from the University of Minnesota School of Journalism in 1967. So you can do the math. I've been at it a long time. And I consider journalism continuing education. I am time after time after time, with every book I write, learning new things about new subjects. And I love that. I love that.
And how many books have you written so far?
40.
40 books. That is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
And do you write them because you want to write on a certain subject, or do the companies call you to write the book for them? How does that work?
I'm happy to say that the companies call me. I have not written a book on spec ever. And I feel really fortunate that I've worked with many Fortune 500 companies and companies that I said to you earlier, with leadership that is ethical leadership. And I appreciate that opportunity.
And that's really amazing. I mean, you mentioned Hormel and Organic Valley. Of course, I know there's lots of them. Those are some of the more familiar ones that I've heard of. So, and it's great because you hear so many negative things about big business, but we also know that big business are still, run by people. And if they're good people, the business is probably going to be still very ethical. And so there's a lot of questions about that. So 11 years ago, you came to an epiphany, it sounded like, and you decided to come here. So what made you decide to do that?
Well, as I said, I'm a native of Minnesota, and I love my home state, and I do spend part of my summers back in Minnesota for obvious reasons, as you can imagine. But the winters are grueling, and it dawned on me one day that I could do the work that I do anywhere in the United States. I wouldn't have to be in Minnesota, even though a majority of my clients have been upper Midwest based companies. So I thought I'd come down to Savannah because I was very intrigued by the beauty of the Georgia coast in particular for cruising my sailboat. And I came down first 11 years ago as an experiment to see if my clients would be okay with my being somewhere else. And actually, they were quite charmed by it. And they would come here for meetings frequently rather than my always traipsing back to Minnesota. So the experiment turned out to be a terrific idea. And I do love living here.
And Tybee, of course, is such a wonderful place, so eclectic and right next to Savannah, and you got
Yep.
so you got a wide range. You go to Hilton Head, you get a whole different other experience. So it's really, and again, we've been here for not as long as you, but we've really enjoyed it. And we also have guests up there. Larry and Jane live in South Carolina, so it's a nice area of Bluffton, and Terry lives closer out towards Statesboro in the city nearby there. So we've got a wide range of people on here who live throughout the area. So
Yes.
it's a blessing to have you in our community. But the reason we are interviewing here is not because of your talents as a business writer, which, as we know, is your main business and has been your livelihood. But we're here for a different reason. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you founded this new organization, what you did, and if you don't mind, maybe a little of the things you've gone through personally, but no pressure there. So for those of you who don't know, she is the founder of the Interfaith Addiction and Recovery Coalition of Savannah, which is a very long name with a big acronym, but also does some really important work. And you're not just getting started, but you're certainly, the dominoes are falling more and more as we go along. So would you tell us a little bit about the organization and why you founded it?
I would be happy to. And I'm happy to report that Robert is a pivotal part of our work, and I'm very appreciative of you. I am a person in term recovery from alcoholism, and I got sober a long time ago in Minnesota. And in those earlier years of my recovery, one of the faith leader of my church in St. Paul, Minnesota, came to me and a couple other folks that she knew were in recovery. And she said, I am new to your church. I just had a heartbreaking conversation with parents who are members of our church, whose daughter is on a dangerous addictive path. And they were looking to me for help and guidance. And there was little I could do because I don't know enough about addiction and recovery to be of support and help. All I could do was offer to pray with them. And that's not good enough, she said. So she asked us to create an educational program in our church in St. Paul, Minnesota, to educate our congregation and also to educate her on the subject of addiction and recovery. We did that. And it's a large church in St. Paul, about 1,200 members. And I know that we had a positive impact. I took that idea when I came down here to Savannah, and I said to my pastor, Ben Gosden at Trinity United Methodist, I said, here's what we did in Minnesota, and here I would like to start with your support here at Trinity United Methodist, a community-wide educational program for faith leaders of all faiths to provide educational forums and support on the subject of addiction and recovery so that faith leaders in Savannah feel better equipped to counsel their faith community members who are struggling themselves, or they love someone who is struggling with the disease. We know that 1 in 10 people in this country are struggling with an addiction of some form. And of those 1 in 10, another 6 other people who love them are struggling. And frankly, during COVID, there has been a spike in substance abuse, not surprisingly.
No, that's pretty obvious.
Mm-hmm. So we're a young organization. We only got started 2 years ago. We created 3 educational forums that first year, and I know, Robert, you were part of them. One was about youth and addiction. Another was about the resources available in Savannah for faith leaders. They don't have to feel as though they have to be therapists. They just have to know enough to be able to direct their members of their faith community to the kind of help that will be of value to them. And the third subject was about faith leaders themselves who have dealt with addiction either in their own lives or in the lives of a loved one. And all 3 forums were very well attended. Anywhere from 35 to 45 faith leaders. And that's a lot in the community of Savannah. So this year we've been doing everything virtually, as we know everyone has. And we have been able to team up with Hazel and Betty Ford for a virtual program on how families are affected by addiction. And we will soon have a presentation by the founder of the children's program at Betty Ford. And he will focus on what faith leaders need to know about children living in families with addiction. So I am very grateful to Hazel and Betty Ford for their collaboration. They are, in my opinion, the gold standard.
Would you explain a little bit who they are? I think some of us are familiar with who they are, obviously, but not everybody is. So
Hazel and Betty Ford was founded more than 70 years ago. And interestingly enough, it was founded when a priest in St. Paul who was drunk almost ran himself off a very high bridge into the Mississippi River. And that was the impetus for a group of folks in the Catholic Church, actually, to create a treatment center that then became Hazelden and then became Hazel and Betty Ford. It's in 17, the program is in the 17 locations around the country now. I am a product of Hazelden Treatment Center and very grateful for the experience. And I was a chairman of the board of Hazelden about, some time ago now, but I still am fortunate to have relationships with the folks there. And we have been very fortunate to forge these collaborations with Betty Ford Hazelden, because they really know, they are encyclopedic on the subject of addiction and recovery.
And we were very privileged to have that very personal, day-long seminar with them just a couple of weeks ago. That was really,
Right.
The name Betty Ford carries a lot of weight in the world for a variety of reasons, but certainly in this area. So what do you, and then before we continue, I'm going to see if Larry or Jane or Terry have any questions they'd like to ask.
Great.
And Larry, here you go.
Yeah, thank you so much for appearing here. Just as a side point of interest, our grandson, Jane and our grandson is at the University of Minnesota right now studying architecture, and it is a gorgeous city. We visited it not last summer, the summer before. Had an opportunity to see some of the thousands. I don't know if our sound is coming through poorly.
Yeah, I think it's just getting a little static there. No worries.
But let me mute myself, and I'll come back on. But if not, continue. I'll ask my questions later.
Okay.
We can type them out if we can't figure it out. Yeah, I've heard. Well, obviously it's not Larry as we hear it again. There we go. No, that didn't fix it. So I don't know what's happening here. because it was working well before. Let me try muting everybody. Let's see here. Okay, there we go. That's a little bit better. So I have not, let me see if I can, okay, maybe coming in through mine. I am not sure this wasn't happening before. Always technical difficulties when you have these things.
Always.
So let me see if I can turn down my sound. That helps. How does that help? That may help a little bit. Well, I've heard always wonderful things about the area, except for the cold weather, which is the reason you came down here. So when you started this organization in Savannah, did you have hurdles to climb? Or did you find people interested? Or I mean, everybody's nice here, so nobody's going to throw you out, but they may say no politely, though.
Everybody is nice here, Robert, but I have to say that the very first thing we did once a small group of volunteers and I came up with this idea, I said, I think we need to have an advisory group of faith leaders who we can go to ask about what they need to know, how we can create forums and educational forums that will be of most use to them. And so I just picked out 7 or 8 faith leaders, interfaith leaders in Savannah, not really knowing the landscape, really, and called them and asked if I could come and visit. And fully expecting that upon describing what we were doing, that someone would say, well, typical Savannah fashion, very politely, that's really interesting, but I don't think I have time to serve, but I would like to encourage you. And Robert was one of the people I called on. And to my delight, every single faith leader I called on said, yes, I will be happy to be part of the advisory team. So we have reflected in our advisory team, Buddhist, Muslim, many stripes of Christian, Jewish, Baha'i, and Quaker faiths represented. And it was very important that we have that kind of interfaith involvement, because alcoholism and drug addiction are very democratic diseases. They affect all of us of all stripes, whether we are people of faith or not, but all faiths.
And I think it's very obvious to, I mean, if you ask a room of however many people who here has felt the effects of this, almost everybody's going to raise their hand in some way or the other. So to get the houses of worship together, I think it's an area that we could work a lot on improving how we work in these areas. So what have you found in Savannah when it comes to working with addiction? Have you found organizations being supportive? Have you found ways to get the education out? What are the ways then that you're trying to do this?
Well, I have to say that I appreciate Savannah because of its size. Coming from Minneapolis, St. Paul metro area, which is very large, then coming to Savannah, it is so much easier to reach people and to have, ask for time with them and have some time with them. It has been such a receptive community. I also, I said to one of my recovering friends in Minnesota, I've just moved to the city of the Big Red Cup, turns out, and and to Tybee Island, which calls itself a drinking island with a fishing problem. And so I'm well aware that addiction is alive and well in Savannah and everywhere else, every other community of the world. But I've found a very receptive community. And I think that the participation in our forums the first year are an indication that faith leaders want to know more about this subject of addiction so that they can truly be of help and counsel to their congregation members who are struggling. And to me, one of the most important parts of this is that our faith leaders speak personally about the subject of addiction. We're doing an e-newsletter now to stay in touch with our faith leaders. And with each newsletter, we ask one of our faith leader advisors to write an essay about their experience with addiction in their own lives. Robert wrote one. Reverend Hilgeman wrote the essay that will appear in the November e-newsletter. My pastor, Ben Gosden at Trinity United Methodist, wrote an essay. And by speaking out loud about addiction, that is a very important way of beginning to address the stigma associated with the disease and the secrecy that goes with it. There's
Yeah,
still a lot of secrecy.
and I think, although that's obviously the 12-step program and AA is connected to religion, I think religions have been a little behind the curve in many ways and admitting the issues that we face and that we can help face. I know in Judaism, there has been a stigma placed on addiction, not as especially a drug addiction, but also alcohol a little bit. And it's that stereotype that says Jews don't do these things, which is a wonderful stereotype if it were true, but obviously it's not. And so the stereotype, I think, helps us hide the fact that we have probably the same percentage of people from anybody else of who's any other house of worship, more or less, depending on where you are. And the drugs will be different depending where you are as well. So it's something that we have to come to terms to. We need people like you to really kind of wake us up sometimes. Larry, did you have a question you wanted to ask? See if your sound is working better.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of comments and questions. It's strange because just recently on Turner, as you know, Rabbi, I'm a big movie fan, and on Turner Classic Movies, they just had a couple interesting movies from years ago, A Hatful of Rain, which was about drug addiction, and Golden Arm. And I was just over at the library in our Sun City Library, and I took out Days of Wine and Roses.
Oh, yes.
Which I haven't seen in years, and I just saw it there, and I said, wow. And it seems to me that, you know, addiction is kind of going into the back burner with COVID, even though COVID is, as you mentioned, possibly enhanced the, not enhanced, but, you know, led to paths of addiction. It just doesn't have the headlines that it did even a year ago in states like West Virginia and Vermont, where it was, you know, you saw the numbers every day. And I was wondering if you could give us an idea of the magnitude of the problem, what you see in Savannah or South Carolina compared to, you know, a totally different state like Minnesota. Is alcohol a bigger problem than you know, legal drugs or overuse of painkillers and things of that nature? I know they're all problems of concern. They're all different, and do you treat them differently?
Wow, big questions. I cannot differentiate between Georgia, South Carolina, and Minnesota. I wish I had those statistics, Larry, but I do not. So the only reliable one we have at the moment is that 1 in 10 people who take a drug or drink can become addicted. 1 in 10. That's the statistic. And that's very frightening when you think about it. That's all I can tell you statistically. I am trying to recall what the Surgeon General under Obama reported. And I don't have it in my head right now. And I don't want to quote something that isn't correct. But the reality is addiction is as serious a health issue as it has ever been in this country. The good news is that there's more willingness to talk about it. The good news is that there are more sources of treatment than ever before, although in this era of COVID, I know that there are treatment centers around the country that are not going to make it financially. and will not survive the COVID era and the economic implications of that. So the need continues, the need for help continues, and the number of resources are predicted to diminish, which is a real concern nationally.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of concerns when it comes to these issues. For me, the biggest concern is that there's no predictability. You know, you never know which family member or which person is going to become addicted. It's
Right.
impossible to tell, whatever the biology is. It can be this cousin you think is, or this sibling, or yourself. It's like roulette. It's the luck of the draw, whether you have that addiction tendency. And so we have to really work hard to try and find out who has these issues early on, because as we know, if you get addicted to certain things when you're young and you don't fix that addiction, it becomes harder and harder as you get older and older. And we see the results of this type of issue facing so many. And I'm sure you've seen more than most in your world, but I know from my perspective, I've seen so many parents through the years who've had, usually it's one child in the family, and all the way through adulthood struggle with it, whereas two others or three others who are raised in the exact same household have no issue at all. So it's really strange. And there's no.
It is true that there is a genetic predisposition to this disease, and that's real. Speaking personally, my mother was an alcoholic, sadly died at 56 years old because of our disease. My brother was an alcoholic. One would think that I would say to myself, wow, I better be on guard. And my reaction to both family members was, well, I'm going to be smarter about this. I'm not going to become an alcoholic. And sure enough, I did. And I have wondered over the years how much of my own education as a youngster would have made any difference at all. I have to believe it would, but as I was growing up, there was the no talk rule. My mother, we hid our mother. We didn't talk about it. And the same was true with my brother. So we need to be open and honest about the effects of this disease, and not to turn it into some kind of a moral statement about anyone. It's a disease, no different. It's a chronic illness. The American Medical Association back in the 1950s declared that addiction is a chronic illness. And let us not forget that.
And you're talking about your family. It sounds very familiar to people who I know who say, you know, they eat fried foods and they never exercise, even though their father died at a heart attack age 45.
Right.
I mean, the sign is there, and it's an issue we know. And
this disease, Robert, early on in recovery, I had an old timer at an AA meeting say, you know, kid, addiction is the only disease that tells you you don't have it. And I have never forgotten that, because denial is a very powerful force. And that, coupled with a phenomenon called the high bottom drunk or addict, has led to people like me who, for many years in my career, I was writing books, serving on nonprofit boards, getting up to play squash at 6 o'clock in the morning, but drinking to blackout the night before. But I was considered a high bottom drunk because I was doing all those things on the surface that looked perfectly normal. And I hid my drinking until eventually I could no longer hide it. So the whole high bottom drunk idea, unfortunately, I think is very much a big part of our society these days.
And you can only be high bottom so long. It eventually does catch up with everyone.
That's right. It does.
Now,
It
getting back to
does.
the organization, how many houses of worship have participated? Are you looking for more people and more houses of worship to start getting on
We
board?
absolutely are. We absolutely are, Robert. We have we're developing a master list of faith communities in Savannah, and it's getting bigger as we continue to grow. But yes, if anyone is listening to this discussion and is part of a faith community who would like to be part of what we're doing, I would love to hear from you, because we will add you to our master mailing list. We have an email, actually a newsletter coming out in the next week or so that I'd love you to see. In fact, one of the articles I think you will find very interesting. It is about a condition called ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences. Have you heard of it, Robert?
I'm not.
Okay, it's fairly new. I'm not surprised. It is a condition that predicts chronic illness in later life. An adverse childhood experience might be physical abuse, mental abuse, depression, an addicted family member, divorce. And if you think about the effects of those adverse experiences in childhood, they can and will affect the health of an adult. And this has now been proven by a very extensive study done back in the early 90s. But it's fairly new in healthcare these days. The Surgeon General of California has written a book about the subject recently, and you'll be hearing more about adverse childhood experiences. So one of the articles in our e-newsletter is about that condition, and the fact that if you have adverse childhood experiences, which I did and a lot of people have, it will contribute to the likelihood of addiction in later life.
It seems like a reasonable assumption. I mean, if they have the science behind it now.
It does.
And so I know there's several. What is the next program you have planned, or the programming you have scheduled for 2021?
2021. We haven't set the date yet, but it will be in January. It will be an hour-and-a-half talk and Q&A with Jerry Moe, who Mrs. Ford hired back in 1993, I believe, to start a program for children who are living in homes where one or both parents are addicted. Hazel and Betty Ford's program now is one of a kind, and Jerry is the director of that program and has not only created it, but is directing it for all these years since the mid-90s. And what he's going to do is talk with faith leaders about what they need to know about addiction and how it affects children in families where addiction is present. And he's a wonderful guy and so knowledgeable. And he will be giving a talk expressly for our Savannah faith leaders in January. We'll be setting the date later this week, and we'll get word out to our community about it. So it'll be a Zoom presentation or a WebEx presentation. And I hope you'll be able to attend. It'll be a weekday. We decided on a Tuesday. That seems to be a day that faith leaders are not quite as busy as they usually are.
It's a lot going on. Things have changed. I know we now film our services on Wednesday. Who would have known that we'd be doing that 10 months ago? So it's been an interesting change, and I know it's been difficult, but we appreciate everything you're doing. For those of you who know, she's pretty much started this organization completely by herself and has really brought it in just a very short time to being very prominent in our community with so many houses of worship. on board. So thank you for all your work. Before we conclude, Terry, Jane, or Larry, do you have any final questions? It looks like Terry is.
Oh,
Terry may have a question.
Hi, Terry.
Hi. I kind of take care of my brother and sister-in-law, and both are alcoholics. And so this is very pertinent to me. I just took my brother to the doctor to have his stomach drained from fluid from edema. His legs are swollen up from it. I just have a problem with his oldest daughter sneaking him alcohol. I don't know if there's any solution for that because I don't live with my brother. But this is helpful for me though.
Here is my first suggestion. I would very much encourage you to find and attend an Al-Anon meeting here in Savannah, because Al-Anon teaches people who love people who are addicted how to live with that experience, what you can do and what you can't do. And if you would like, I'll be happy to call you with information about where those Al-Anon meetings are occurring. They're mostly all online on Zoom these days, which actually makes it easier for a lot of people. And I would really encourage you to do that, because when you love somebody who is struggling with addiction, our natural human instinct is to try to save them, fix them, and we can't. But there are things that we can do to encourage their recovery and to also take care of ourselves in the process. So if you like, I'd be happy to call you. Do you have, would you like me to?
We won't give the number over here, but I'll email you her number if she says it's all right.
That sounds great.
And I think also, Carol, Terry lives farther out, so she's 45 minutes or an hour from Savannah.
Okay.
But nowadays, I guess one of the benefits of the modern technology and with everything going on is you can attend an Al-Anon meeting probably anywhere in the world, or anywhere in the country. So if you have friends or family in a certain place, you could probably go with them, whereas before you wouldn't be able to. So that's
absolutely true. That's one of the great advantages, although I know that a lot of us have Zoom fatigue.
Yeah.
If we didn't have Zoom, speaking as someone in recovery, even though I have a lot of years of recovery, I would be concerned about my health if I couldn't connect with people in the program by Zoom. It is a disease of isolation. So thank God for Zoom.
It's
a good point. Disease of isolation. Larry, you had a question before we conclude.
I was just wondering, on a personal level, I mean, you experienced, as a child, and then, this child syndrome, so to speak, may have had the effect. What do you attribute your recovery to and your persistence to stay with it? How did you recognize the problem and have the, the courage to stay? I know it's different for everybody.
Thank you for asking, Larry. In my 12-step program, we call this the Gift of Desperation. I became desperate. My life had become unmanageable, even though on the surface it appeared that I was leading a normal life. And when my coworker came to me and said, "I'm scared. Here's what I see." I knew she was right. And I had been hiding my disease for a very long time from her and from everyone else. But I also knew, having watched my brother nearly die from this disease and to see my mom die, that it was that serious. So I had reached a point where I was desperate. And I also knew that there was a way out. I knew that recovery was possible, because my brother, though he was an addict for many, many years, for the last 5 years of his life, he was in recovery. And I saw the change in him. And I knew that there was another way to live. Does that help?
That's a beautiful way to think about it, that it is. I mean, again, we think of addiction as being a serious disease, but there is help. I mean, not everybody is going to be helped, but if you look for it and we can provide it for you, there is a way to help significantly. So
It's true.
that's one of the things you're bringing to all of us, is that we can assist. It's just, we have to learn what the best way is for us to do it. So again, thank you so much for being on our program here today.
You're so welcome.
Everyone, this will be on, excuse me, YouTube in perpetuity. Just go to our YouTube page, and always pleased to have interesting folk. We'll be having a interview session next week, and then we'll take off the following week, I believe, for Thanksgiving, and then start up again in December. So Carol, real pleasure. I'm sure I'll be talking with you soon. I look forward to the January meeting. And if anybody has any questions, please just email me and I'll forward them on to her. And I hope everybody has a good day. And then Terry, I'll make sure to email her your phone number, if that's okay.
Thank you.
All right. Stay safe, everyone. And thank you again, Carol. Really appreciate it. As always, you're amazing. And love the background. That was awesome. As I was telling somebody, I think before we started, the irony is I'm actually at Tybee Island, and I just wanted my office in the background, and you're somewhere else and wanted Tybee in the background. So I don't know. It's crazy. So I'm going to go surf a little bit right now.
Good,
my bathing suit on. This is my surfing suit.
I love it. I love it.